You have come here perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps because a quiet tremor answered when you heard the single word, empath. Why did that word tug at you? Listen closely. This is not a gentle meeting to applaud sensitivity or to trade soft consolations. We are not here to sentimentalize a trait. We have come to call forth the older patterns that lie beneath what the modern mind casually calls feelings. When I speak of the empath, I'm not naming merely a tender-hearted person who mirrors another's mood. I mean a psychic conduit, a lightning rod through which the world's unconscious pours itself. This is not always a grace. Today's popular idea of empathy tends to dress the empath in comforting clichés, yet such simplifications often steal the edge of what is true. When a concept becomes fashionable, it is frequently drained of its power. In the deeper register I have seen in dreams, in patient observation, and in archetypal visions, the empath is far from a smiling spiritual caricature. They are a bearer of weight, a carrier of shadows that are not their own. And often they do not know the forces that possess them. Have you ever felt a sorrow that seemed borrowed, a grief that had no origin within you? That is the empath's signature, to take on burdens that belong to a larger collective body. To grasp this fully, we must look beneath the personal, beneath even the interpersonal. The empath does not simply tune in psychologically to another's mood. They are unconsciously porous to the archetypal currents that move through many people at once. Picture, if you will, a village healer during a season of roiling storms, kneeling in a wide field and vomiting blood, not because their body is failing, but because the land itself has fallen ill. That is an image of the empath, one who transduces what they do not own. They feel what was never theirs to carry. If this service remains unconscious, it will devour them. In an earlier dream of mine, before I had language for archetypes, I saw a woman standing on a bridge above a yawning chasm. She had no eyes. Her hands were outstretched, trembling as if both reaching for help and warding something back. From the dark pit below rose many voices, crying out in despair, in longing, in confusion. The woman could not see those faces, but she felt every cry. Each one made her body into a map of pain, as though each voice had carved a wound into her flesh. That woman is the empath. Her blindness is not literal. It is a blindness of sight that forces the other senses, especially the psychic, to become acute. She cannot locate the source by looking. Instead, she registers the world by being overwhelmed by it. Do you sense how precarious that is? To live as an open channel is to risk losing the boundary between self and storm. Hold this with care. The empath is not sentimentality dressed up as spirituality. They are a vessel, a threshold, an ancient office of suffering and translation. If they are to survive, and perhaps to serve, they must learn to recognize the currents, to distinguish what belongs to them from what belongs to the many. Only then can they refuse to be consumed by the very compassion that defines them. We do not gather merely to speak of sensitivities or sentimentality. The empath is a bearer of weight, a carrier of shadows, not their own, and they are often unaware of the forces that have possessed them. Her blindness is not literal, it is the blindness to the origin of her suffering. She cannot tell where the voices end and where she begins. She is the psychic sponge, and no one has shown her how to wring herself out. This is not a small flaw, it is an urgent vulnerability. An open vessel without the vessel's wisdom is exposed to forces that have no moral compass. The unconscious is a cauldron, at once sacred and chaotic. When an empath opens to another's psychic material, whether through deliberate compassion or simply because their energetic membrane is porous, they invite into themselves that person's unprocessed shadow. Most people walk the world with long, trailing shadows, parts unloved, unexamined, or feared. What is unloved in one person will often seek refuge in another. The empath, if unguarded, becomes that refuge. Consider the story I learned from African tribal lore, told to me by a young dreamer who wandered the forest edge and heard unnamed spirits whisper, not in words, but as raw feeling. Sudden waves of grief, terror, longing would crash over the dreamer, tears at odd hours, trembling in stillness, laughter when no one spoke. The tribe feared possession and called the elder. He did not banish the spirits. Instead, he taught the dreamer to speak with them, to name them. Naming, the elder showed, is not magic trivia. It is a form of discernment. It is how the container regains its shape. To be an empath without discernment is to be a playground for disowned archetypes. To be an empath who names what they carry, that is the alchemist's path. It is not enough to say, I feel what others feel. You must ask, why do I feel it? Where does it enter me? What am I doing with it? The unconscious is a trickster. It rarely arrives with horns and flame. Often it comes as compassion so overwhelming it drowns you, as a compulsive need to help that erodes your boundaries, or as a love that masks a shadow which has latched onto your soul and mistaken your body for its graveyard. I have watched empaths fall in love with the very people who are destroying them, not from weakness, but from an unconscious seduction by another's wounds. They feel the ache. In feeling it, they become caretaker, savior, silent sponge. There is a dark reversal here, what some traditions call enantiodromia. The healed becomes the harmed. The bearer of light becomes host to another shadow. The longer this pattern persists without awareness, the more the empath loses the thread of who they truly are. If you are an empath, you must understand your gift is not simply emotional. Learn to name what you carry. Learn the boundary between your own pain and the borrowed weight. Only then can the vessel hold without being consumed. If you are an empath, you must understand your gift is not simply emotional. It is psychic and it is archetypal. You are attuned not just to feelings, but to the collective currents that shape humanity itself. You register not only a single emotion in another, but the layered score behind it, their ancestors' echoes, the gods they never named, lives left unlived. When someone enters your presence, it is not merely their smile or their tears that you take in. You sense their lineage, their buried gods, their unlived lives, and unless you have made contact with your own unconscious, unless you have traversed the underworld of your own psyche, you will be overwhelmed. There is a temptation within spiritual circles to romanticize sensitivity, to parade it as a badge of honor. But in the inner economy of the soul, no gift arrives without its shadow. All light scatters darkness. Empathy, perhaps more than any single faculty, draws shadow up into the open. Consider this. What happens when a person represses rage for decades? Does it vanish like mist? No, it waits, it congeals, and it searches silently for a field to inhabit. When such a person meets an empath, especially an empath unacquainted with their own unresolved fury, that rage can jump. It leaps like fire into dry wood. The empath, unprotected, may begin to feel irritability, depression, inflammation, not recognizing that they carry a burning that is not their own. I once worked with a woman who wept constantly. Tears arrived before she spoke. The grief seemed automatic, as if pulled from an invisible reservoir. At first, she believed her wounds came from her parents, her lovers, from life's standard cruelties, and indeed there were wounds. But over months of careful descent, we discovered a deeper pattern. She had absorbed the ungrieved sorrow of her mother, her grandmother, and a long line of women forbidden to cry. She had become the vessel for a generational shadow, and in carrying that sorrow, she lost the language for her own. Empaths, if you do not distinguish what is yours from what belongs to others, you will drown in a sea of unnamed ghosts. The gift of feeling is sacred, but sacredness requires structure. The vessel must be strong enough to contain the fire, otherwise the fire consumes. Ask yourself, how have you learned to shelter what comes through you? How have you practiced saying, "This is not mine"? There is another dream I must offer you. A man walks through a cathedral of mirrors. Each step returns a voice he does not know. He turns to a mirror expecting himself and sees a weeping child. Another mirror shows a screaming soldier, another a dying mother. Faces press back at him, but none belong to the man who entered. He screams, "Which one is me?" The mirrors do not answer, they only reflect. This too is the empath lost among other people's inner worlds, unable to remember the face they wore before they began to feel everyone else's pain. If this image resonates, if the cathedral echoes in you, then you must ask plainly, what work have I done to know myself? Not the tidy work of labels or affirmations, but the hard work of confrontation in the crucible of your own depths. The vessel must be strong enough to contain the fire, otherwise the fire consumes. Have you stood in your own underworld and spoken to your shadow? Have you stood in your own underworld and spoken to your shadow? Have you acknowledged the parts of you that use empathy to feel important, needed, even holy? Have you faced the dark pleasure that can rise when you are the only one who understands another's pain? Yes, even the empath is not exempt from shadow motives. These are not accusations, they are invitations to honest seeing. Sometimes the act of helping others is a way of avoiding the self. Sometimes carrying everyone else's suffering is more comforting than the silence of facing your own. We are strange creatures. We drape avoidance in virtue, and the unconscious, ever subtle, smiles behind the veil. Empathy is not salvation. It is a threshold, a doorway that can lead either to healing or to subtle self-loss. Do you feel the pull to cross it without looking back? To pass through wisely, you must learn the art of boundaries, not as cold, rigid walls of defensiveness, but as a porous, discerning membrane belonging to the individuated soul. Learn to say, "I feel you, but I do not become you." Learn to say, "I see your wound, but I will not house it within my psyche." Learn to say, "I offer presence, not possession." These phrases are not slogans, they are practical discriminations that preserve the container while allowing compassion to flow. There is no greater tragedy for empaths than becoming invisible to themselves, merging so deeply with the suffering of others that their own soul fades to a whisper. This happens daily within marriages where one partner carries the other's emotions like an unpaid servant, in families where the most sensitive child unconsciously becomes the household's emotional regulator, in therapists, teachers, and ministers who confuse compassion with codependence. This confusion is not benign, it is archetypal possession. The empath without the ballast of inner work is absorbed by the wounded healer archetype, Chiron in myth. When Chiron rises unexamined, it demands suffering as if suffering were the proof of purpose. One begins to believe they are meant to hurt, that their value lies in the capacity to suffer alongside or even for others. This is a distortion, not the conscious, transformative pain of shadow work, but an endless reenactment of unconscious service to other people's brokenness. The empath loses autonomy not from simple kindness, but because the archetype has taken the reins. You must understand, archetypes are not mere metaphors. They are living patterns of psychic energy, older than language, older than recorded history. When you feel inexplicably pulled to help, when you leave a room exhausted, when being needed inflates you with elation, pause. These sensations are not always only your personal feelings. They may be the voices of invisible forces acting through you. Notice them, name them, and practice returning to your own center. They are living patterns of psychic energy, older than language, older than history. The archetype of the savior, the martyr, the mother, even the seducer. The archetype of the savior, the martyr, the mother, even the seducer, all of these can slip quietly into the unconscious life of the empath, animating them like a puppet dangling on spiritual strings. But remember this, puppets do not individuate, they perform. To become whole, the empath must undertake the dangerous, sacred act of separation. Separation not from love, but from entanglement. Not from presence, but from unhealthy fusion. This separation is not coldness. It is warmth with a spine, compassion rooted in strength. It is to stand before another's anguish and say, I will not abandon you, but I will not bleed for you. It is to feel the tidal wave of someone's unspoken grief and still say, I will sit beside you, but I will not become the ocean. Such boundaries do not kill love, they preserve it. One patient of mine once dreamed of a forest, ancient and tangled, with roots twisting like fingers through time itself. At its center stood a stone well, deep and seemingly bottomless. Around this well sat empaths, men and women with hands pressed against their hearts, weeping. And in the well swam the shadows of those they loved. The empaths peered in, convinced that if they wept enough, cared enough, they might draw those shadows upward into the light. But the well had no end. The tears, instead of saving, only fed it. This is what happens when empathy turns compulsive. It nourishes the very darkness it longs to redeem. Here lies a secret few dare speak. Not everyone wants to be healed. Not every soul is ready to awaken. And the empath who confuses their gift with responsibility will spend their life reaching into the depths for the unwilling, only to be pulled down themselves. Discernment is essential. Does your empathy liberate or entrap? Does it honor another's path, or does it secretly violate it by insisting they must be elsewhere than they are? Even healing can become control when it springs from fear. Parents whose empathy for their children becomes suffocation. Lovers whose sensitivity curdles into manipulation. Friends whose compassion hides a hunger to be irreplaceable. This is the shadow side of empathy, where care becomes currency and feeling turns into power. Perhaps you recoil, not me, you say, but if you are truly empathic, you must dare to turn that feeling inward. Ask yourself, where has my gift become a mask? Where have I confused connection with obligation? Where have I made myself indispensable to others so I would not have to face being alone with myself? This is not judgment. It is the path of integration, the move toward wholeness. For true empathy is not the taking on of another's pain, but the witnessing of it without losing one's center. It is the art of standing in the fire of another's suffering and remaining unburned, not through cold detachment, but through deep rootedness in the self. And what is this self? It is the totality of who you are. It is the totality of who you are, not just your feelings, not just your light, but your shadow, your instinct, your history, your future. Not just your feelings, not just your light, but the forgotten corners of your shadow, the pulse of instinct, the roots of history, and the seeds of what has yet to come. The self is not an abstract idea or a fragile concept. It is the living center of the psyche, the axis around which the archetypes orbit like planets circling their sun. When the empath finds this center, they cease to be porous, no longer a sponge for the world's unchecked sorrows. Instead, they become anchored. From that anchor flows true compassion, no longer sacrifice that drains, but strength that sustains. Yet this path is never easy. It demands descent, a deliberate journey downward. The empath must travel into the underworld of their own psyche, through chambers where forgotten wounds and unspoken motives dwell. There they must meet the parts of themselves that crave being needed, that fear abandonment so deeply they dissolve into others for safety, that confuse intimacy with enmeshment. These are not moral failings. They are survival strategies born from deep woundings, often early in life, when sensitivity was punished, mocked, or exploited. I have worked with patients whose empathy was not born of spiritual grace, but of necessity. A girl who learned to read her father's every subtle shift in mood to escape his wrath. A boy who became hyper-attuned to his mother's depression so that a joke, a hug, or a forced smile could pull her back from despair. These children did not choose empathy, it was carved into them. What they later called a gift was first a shield, a form of vigilance against chaos. And a gift that grows from fear must one day be purified. Here is where the questions sharpen like thresholds. Who was I before the world taught me to feel for others first? What part of me still believes that love must carry pain? What would remain if I no longer absorbed the suffering around me? Would I still be loved if I stopped bleeding for others? These are not academic questions. They are initiations, gates into maturity of soul. And this is where the empath meets their true test, to feel deeply, yet remain whole. To open the heart without losing the spine. To love without bleeding away life. To help without hollowing oneself. To witness the suffering of the world and yet refuse to be defined by it. This is not detachment, this is mastery, a state both tender and unyielding. Let me leave you with one final image for now, though many more arise as we speak. A woman stands before a roaring fire. Around her a storm rages, winds shrieking, voices of anguish circling, visions of injustice streaking the sky. In her hands she holds a bowl, fragile yet firm. She lowers it gently to the earth, in it her own tears. She kneels and whispers, not to the storm, but to herself, "I feel you, but I am not you." And in that moment, the storm begins to still. Not because she absorbed its chaos, but because she surrendered her resistance and reclaimed her sovereignty. This is the true empath, not the sponge, but the vessel. Not the martyr, but the mystic. Not the savior, but the mirror. And the deeper we journey into the archetypal landscape of the empath, the more we are drawn into the realm of dreams. The deeper we travel into the archetypal landscape of the empath, the more we are drawn into the realm of dreams. For it is there that the truth of their gift begins to unfold without the censorship of the ego. For it is there, in the dream world, that the true nature of the empath begins to reveal itself, unfiltered, unpolished, beyond the flattering illusions that waking culture often weaves. Dreams do not flatter, they do not romanticize empathy as society so often does. Instead, they show it in its primal form, raw, symbolic, alchemical, often unsettling in its honesty. I once worked with a young man, tender, intelligent, and self-identified as an empath. Whenever he walked into a room, it was as if invisible hands pressed down on his chest. He could not rest while others were in pain. Yet his compassion came at a cost. He was utterly exhausted, as though his very soul was dissolving into the stories of others. He did not come to me in search of wisdom or lofty insight. He came because he was terrified he was vanishing. He shared with me a dream. In it, he stood at the mouth of a cave. From within, screams echoed, chilling and relentless. Faces of those he had loved and lost drifted past him in the darkness, each one calling his name. A child clung desperately to his leg. A man bled heavily at his feet. A woman, her skin like ash, stretched out her hand toward him. He tried to run, but discovered that his body was rooted, immovable. Then from the deepest part of the cave came a voice, not a scream, but a whisper. "You made this your temple. You made this your temple." That line, I told him, was not just poetic imagery. It was a verdict. It was the unconscious revealing the truth. He had constructed a psychic cathedral out of pain. He had confused suffering with purpose. His need to carry the burdens of the world had turned him into a sanctuary for every lost and wandering voice. But here lies the danger. The soul cannot thrive in a temple built of ghosts. Dreams often dare to reveal what waking life keeps hidden. And for the empath, they uncover the secret bargains we make with pain. If I suffer with them, they won't feel alone. If I absorb their rage, perhaps they won't explode. If I disappear, maybe they will finally breathe. Yet the unconscious does not reward martyrdom. It calls for balance, for truth, for confrontation with the self. The empath, if willing, must reclaim what has been scattered, not to fall into selfishness, but to become sovereign once more. This is the call of individuation, the process by which one becomes who they truly are, not a mask, not a reflection, sum of traumas, projections, or inherited griefs, but a whole being. And for empaths, individuation begins not by confronting the pain of others, but by facing the parts of themselves they exiled long ago in the name of caretaking. They must descend into their own caves. They must ask, what is my anger trying to teach me? What does my grief conceal? What part of me has grown addicted to playing the wounded one? And more daring still, what part of me has become addicted to rescuing the wounded in others? This is not comfortable work. It shatters illusions. It dismantles the noble mask of the healer and reveals instead the wounds beneath the wounded healer. It shatters illusions. It strips the empath of their noble identity and reveals the wounds beneath the wound healer. It asks them to stop bleeding on altars that were never meant to hold them. It calls for the end of sacrificing one's vitality on shrines built from other people's wounds, shrines that can never be satisfied. And it demands something far more frightening, the willingness to let others carry and feel their own pain. Let me be clear. Empathy, when conscious, is holy, luminous, a channel of grace. But when unconscious, it becomes contamination. It is energetic boundary collapse, a dissolving of the self into what does not belong. It is the flooding of one's inner world with archetypal residue carried through unseen currents. And that residue often runs deeper than we realize. In many empaths, we uncover ancestral entanglements, sensitivities passed down like invisible heirlooms, once sacred, now burdensome. A woman whose great-grandmother once served as the village medium may, without knowing why, feel overwhelmed by the noise of modern crowds. A man whose ancestors were burned for witchcraft may inherit an unconscious guilt surrounding his own gift of perception, hiding it beneath exaggerated emotionality rather than honing it as the clear skill it was meant to be. Empathy, in such cases, is not only personal, it is sometimes the vessel of ancestral grief, the long echo of unresolved suffering searching for a voice in a sensitive descendant. And unless that descendant awakens, unless they choose to feel with awareness and discernment, they risk becoming yet another vessel of unconscious repetition. The dreams of such individuals often reveal archetypal images in their most potent, haunting forms: serpents coiling around the heart, vast oceans swallowing fragile children, ancestral homes engulfed in flames, while the dreamer stands powerless, weeping without water to quench the blaze. These visions are not merely personal nightmares, they are the language of the deep psyche, delivering a warning. You are overfull with what is not yours. I recall one patient, an artist, exquisitely attuned to beauty, rhythm, and sorrow. She brought me a recurring dream. Walking through an ancient museum filled with sculptures of those she had known, parents, lovers, friends. Each sculpture bore a small plaque that read, "Do not touch, property of the dead." And yet in the dream she touched them every time, and every time they bled. This dream, I told her, was not punishment, it was instruction. Her empathy had transformed into necromancy, an endless reaching backward into grief that belonged to another time, another soul. She did not need less feeling, she needed more discernment. For some, suffering is sacred to witness, to honor in silence, but some pain is meant to be buried, sealed, and returned to the earth. When unconscious, empaths risk becoming gravediggers for the collective's abandoned corpses. They wander psychic battlefields, mistaking every wounded soldier for a soul they must save. Yet not all pain seeks healing. Some pain seeks extinction, and to interfere is to step into the role of God in a theatre we cannot hope to comprehend. So what then? Are we meant to harden our hearts, to turn away from the wounded, protecting ourselves so fiercely that nothing can touch us? No, that is not the path. The calling is to refine our empathy, to transform it from sponge to sword, from open wound to listening mirror, from martyrdom to mysticism. We are to refine our empathy to transform it from sponge to sword, from open wound to listening mirror, from martyrdom to mysticism. The true empath is not fragile. The true empath is initiated. They have walked through the shadow realms and claimed their own pain, not as a curse, but as a teacher that reshaped them from the inside out. They have turned inward and faced their unmet needs with courage that few dare to summon. They have spoken with their rage, their shame, and their terror, listening to each voice without denial, without disguise. And because of this, They no longer confuse empathy with entanglement. They no longer dissolve into another storm. Instead, they can feel without falling. They can witness without absorbing. They can love without losing themselves. And from that place, their gift transforms, no longer a liability, but a lamp. They illuminate without burning, a steady flame in the dark. They guide without dragging others behind them. They offer presence, not rescue. And most importantly, they remember it is not their role to carry the weight of the entire world. A sacred task is to carry themselves with such integrity, with such rootedness, that the world, by simply being near them, remembers how to carry itself. This is where we arrive at the threshold, not of despair, but of transfiguration. Everything that has been spoken, everything unearthed from the caverns of your inner world, now asks for only one thing. Not admiration, not endless analysis, but embodiment. The empath who has walked through darkness, who has turned inward with unflinching honesty, emerges not as a broken healer, not as a perpetual sponge, but as something far rarer, an initiated presence. A living vessel of the self. One who understands that empathy is not absorption, it is alchemy. It is the fire through which suffering is recognized but not adopted, witnessed but not owned, transformed yet never stolen. When the empath becomes conscious, they no longer enter rooms scanning silently for pain to fix, for wounds to bind. Instead, they walk as mirrors, not mirrors that merely reflect wounds back, but mirrors that remind others of what they have forgotten about themselves. They become what I have called the wounded mystic, not because they continue to bleed, but because their scars have become symbols of survival. Symbols of having faced the union with the unconscious and returning with wisdom in hand. And yet, there is a subtle danger here. For as the empath becomes empowered, another archetype stirs from the depths, the magician, the one who has seen through illusions, who understands the hidden exchanges of energy, who can speak to another's shadow without flinching. But this magician, if not anchored in humility, begins to believe they are above suffering and become intoxicated by their own insight. They turn wisdom into weapon, empathy mutates into manipulation, and so the cycle repeats, this time cloaked in more clever disguises, so beware. Initiation is not a final badge to wear. It is not an ending, but a lifelong vigilance. To be a conscious empath is to rise each day and ask, is this mine? Am I feeling or am I fusing? Am I healing or am I controlling? Am I present or am I performing? These questions are not signs of weakness nor of doubt. They are signs of true maturity, the very pulse of an awakened life. The conscious empath is no longer afraid to be unsure. They no longer rush to soothe, to fix, or to patch over every silence with words. Instead, they allow stillness to exist between themselves and another. They allow the other to be broken, to be raw, to be unfinished, without leaping in as savior, without losing themselves in the flood. This restraint is not coldness, it is reverence. They trust the psyche's own intelligence, knowing that sometimes pain itself is the doorway, not the enemy to be vanquished. And what of relationships? Here too, everything begins to shift. The unconscious empath is often magnetized to the wounded, the chaotic, the narcissistic, not out of ignorance, but because a part of them still believes that worth must be proven through endurance. They are pulled, almost unconsciously, toward those who mirror their unhealed inner child. The child who once learned that love must be earned through suffering. But the conscious empath no longer seeks that cycle. They begin to crave clarity instead of confusion, nourishment instead of depletion. They seek out those who truly see them, not just those who need them. In this new space, they build bonds not rooted in trauma, but grounded in truth. And if loneliness comes, and it will, they no longer rush to fill it with the ghosts of broken souls. They sit with it, they breathe with it, they listen to its message, they let the silence speak, and in that silence they begin to hear the voice of their own soul. It is here, in this quiet threshold, that the empath reclaims their truest gift, not as a mere receptor of pain, but as a revealer of soul. They no longer dim their intuition to keep others comfortable, nor do they contort their boundaries in desperation to avoid abandonment. They understand that saying no is not rejection, it is not cruelty, it is protection of the sacred space within. I once dreamt of a lake, still, silver, infinite, its surface reflecting not just the sky, but something deeper, something timeless. Along its quiet shore stood those I had known, students, patients, even myself at different ages. Each gazed into the lake, each searching for answers, and at the center a single figure stood, untouched by ripple or wind. They spoke no words, they simply were. And yet everyone who met their eyes saw themselves, not their wounds, not their needs, but the luminous image of who they might become. This, I believe, is the destiny of the awakened empath, to become a mirror, not for pain, but for potential. To walk not as a martyr bound to endless sacrifice, but as a reminder of what wholeness looks like. To feel not everything indiscriminately, but only what is true. To carry not the suffering of the world, but the vibration of integrity. And in doing so, they do not abandon the path of feeling. No, they transcend it. They refine it. They transmute it into something enduring. They become what alchemy has always pointed toward, the union of opposites, the heart and the spine, the open palm and the grounded root, the healer and the human together at last. So if you see yourself in these words, if you have recognized within your own dreams the symbols of overgiving, of emotional hunger, of sacred exhaustion, then hear this clearly. It is not spoken as condemnation, but as an invitation. Step back from the shadows that were never yours to carry. Turn inward into the quiet you have long fled. Dare to face the silence that once felt unbearable. Speak gently to the parts of you that learn to merge only to survive. Acknowledge them, honor them, thank them for what they gave you, and then, with tenderness, release them. You are not a sponge to absorb endlessly. You are not a sacrifice to be consumed for the comfort of others. You are not broken, waiting to be pieced together through someone else's need. You are, instead, a living threshold, a place where energy transforms into meaning, where suffering is seen, not swallowed whole, where empathy ceases to be a burden and begins to crystallize as wisdom. And if you can hold this subtle fire, if you can embody this delicate clarity, then you will not only endure your sensitivity, you will sanctify it. You will walk among the world's countless ghosts, yet no longer be haunted by them. You will witness pain without mistaking it for penance. You will feel deeply, yet without falling apart. And most importantly of all, you will return to yourself, not as a rescuer, forever bound to sacrifice, but as a soul, sovereign and whole,